A Parkland school shooting survivor is on the defense today, asking for a second chance after his acceptance to Harvard University was officially rescinded. Kyle Kashuv lost his spot at the prestigious university after written comments he made at the age of 16 came to light. In one thread, he used the N-word 11 times, joking that he was good at typing it because, quote, practice makes perfect. In a letter to Kashuv, Harvard wrote this: the committee takes seriously the qualities of maturity and moral character. After careful consideration, the committee voted to rescind your admission to Harvard. In an interview on Fox last night, he tried to explain his behavior at 16.
At that time, it was really a friend group where who could say the most shocking thing and most extreme thing for the sake of shock value. And I'm extremely sorry for it. And I wish I could have taken it back, but I can't. The person who wrote those things is not who I am today.
Back with me now, former Congressman David Jolly, Wes Moore, and Eddie Glaude. Eddie, I must go to you first. You are a professor and chairman of the Center for African American Studies at another Ivy League university, Princeton. You must have some thoughts, some insights into what you just heard.
Right. So, look, it is certainly the case that young people make mistakes. I could only imagine what my life would be like if I had there was social media when I was 15, 16. Actually, 16, I was at Morehouse. I was in college at 16. So I understand the appeal to youthfulness, but there must be consequences for one's actions in these moments. And Harvard has every right, as they try to build a community that allows for flourishing, for the kind of education that they take themselves to be representative of, to rescind his admission. And I think it's important that it sends a message to the broader public, right, that this sort of language, these sorts of beliefs and commitments cannot be sanctioned in the public domain whatsoever, because we're so awash in this hatred now. It makes sense to me that an institution like Harvard would want not to admit him to their community.
Wes, I want to share another bit of what Kyle said last night, defending himself on Fox News.
I think that people can mature and people can change, and I really don't hope, I don't hope we continue moving in this direction, because I think the purpose of education is to assist people in their progression of growth and change.
16, that was just 2 years ago, but if we dug into every old post or private message of every student in America, is there a risk that we could take this too far? Some people out there are saying they're kids are kids, but that is when you accept someone into college, when they're a teenager.
Yeah, I mean, there's a risk, but there's also a responsibility. People need to know who people are, who at their core. You know, Harvard or any other institution is not asking everyone to think the same. They want people to have a diverse set of opinions, but they want people to walk onto that campus with a shared sense of humanity, with a shared sense of understanding. And that's that bar that was not hit. You know, I think about it when I first went to Johns Hopkins, and as a kid from Baltimore, making it to Hopkins was amazing, because that was a school that we didn't think we belonged at. We thought that was for the rich kids or for the kids from out of town. And then here I was now walking on to Hopkins campus feeling like, wow, this is a place that wants me and I belong and that people want me here. And then I remember during our orientation, one of the first things that they did was they advised us about which neighborhoods not to go into in Baltimore, to include the ones that I grew up in. And immediately this place that I thought was and this was years ago, but the place that I thought was now welcoming me, sharing, understanding, and seeing my humanity, one of the first experiences that I had there was reminding me of something different.
But do you think they were doing that as an act of exclusivity or racism, or were they doing it from a place of public safety?
No, I think they were doing it in their perspective from a place of protection. But I think the thing that we also want to remember is the protection goes well past a physical protection. That we want all of our students to feel like they are a place that is welcoming, that a place that understands who they are and observant of who they are and respectful of who they are. So I think, as you know, Harvard didn't just have the right to make the decision. I think they had the responsibility that as they learn this information, to make sure that it wasn't just about us protecting a freedom of speech, but it's also about respecting a freedom that other people have, that all students should feel when they walk onto that campus. And that was, I think, the baseline of the decision.
We're talking about morality and humanity society of an institution that only accepts 4% of their applicants as it is. But, Congressman, I do have to ask the question, do you see politics here? Because we need to note Kyle became a public activist after he survived the shooting at Parkland. But in his own lane, he was one of the few activists who was defending Second Amendment rights. There are conservatives today who have cried foul over Harvard's decision, saying that they are kowtowing to the left. Do you think there's any reason to question political motive?
I don't. Stephanie, I take a much harder line on this. I think this is the perfect story for our time when within our culture we have leaders who are giving greater permission to racist statements and people with racist feelings. They're giving them greater equity. I think it's important for Harvard to say, not in our community. That is not a voice that we are going to give equity in our diverse community. When I saw it, Steph, I had the same reaction of a lot of people that perhaps a young man deserves redemption. But if you look at this story is greater than Harvard. And what the screenshots show he said, according to the Huffington Post, which are not getting enough play, is this young man posted, "Kill the effing Jews." He posted the N-word repeatedly, and he referred to one of these shoot-'em-up video games and suggested that they should put a map of that on his high school. Now, this was 2 years before Parkland, but my immediate reaction when I really dug into this is these are the social media postings we see of a shooter, and we ask, where were the signs? See something, say something. We see a shooter, and then we go back and we look at social media posts, and this is exactly what we see. I understand the sensitivity towards this young man because of Parkland. I'm not a mental health professional to assess him on those grounds. But what I would suggest...
Congressman, is that too far? Can you make a leap like that?
It is not. No, it is not, Stephanie, because if an incident were to occur, and again, I'm not saying it will with this young man, but these are the exact posts we find of people, particularly those who advocate for gun control, for stronger gun rights, who has been given an audience with the President of the United States in the Oval Office, by Nikki Haley as well, by Vice President Mike Pence, who was an invited guest to a rally, to speak at a rally for Matt Gaetz and Ron DeSantis, who was a speaker at the NRA recently. You have to question, how do we promote somebody with these social media posts in their background? The young man deserves redemption. But he also deserves a closer look to whether somebody with this profile should be able to purchase a firearm under the gun laws in the United States. This is a bigger question than Harvard. I commend Harvard for making this decision. I think it was a clear-cut decision on their part, no controversy at all.
Eddie, the congressman is making the point, this isn't about immaturity or bad behavior. These are dangerous posts in his mind. I want to share what Harvard said in defending their position in withdrawing his admission. They write this: if an admitted student engages or has engaged in behavior that brings into question their honesty, maturity, or moral character, they're in the right to do this, is what they're saying. But they're in the right not to accept him. But now this is a national incident. You've got an 18-year-old boy on national TV. Maybe it's an international incident. Should Harvard be doing this before? Should they be in a position where they're rescinding, or should they not have accepted him to begin with?
Well, I mean, look, it would have been helpful if the information had come to light while they were making their admissions decision. It didn't. It came late, so I understand the decision. But I want to be very clear here, Stephanie. It's so interesting how innocence can be attached to certain bodies, right? Here you have a kid. They call him 16. He's 16 years old. Khalif Crowder was 16. They threw him in Rikers. He's not here. Central Park 5, one of them was 14. Right? So we have people who are, they want to attribute innocence to certain folk, but want to deny innocence to other folk. And so part of what I'm suggesting here is that it's not that he's just young and he will grow and he's mature. If you hold that view, hold it consistently for all of our children. For all of our children. If you don't, then stop playing political games. He said the N-word. He said kill Jews. He was embroiled in a kind of hate-filled discourse. Harvard does not want that as a part of its community. He will learn his lesson. If he does, he will probably land on his feet. He's going to soar, and hopefully he will change as a human being and become the kind of human being that God created him to be.
But wouldn't he change at Harvard?
I don't think that's Harvard's responsibility. I think that what happens, what Harvard is doing, and I think that's a very important point, that had this information come up prior, that would have factored into his admissions decision in the first place. Harvard doesn't see itself as, if Harvard's not a reform school, right? Harvard is a place
Best school
where
in the country.
And it's but it's a place that's saying for the people that come through our gates, these are people who are destined to make an important contribution to the world, an important moral contribution to our society. Yeah. But it's a place that at first, at our baseline, we're asking people to see other people's humanity, and we're asking people to see other people's morality and understand what that means and why that's important. And he did not make that bar.
Congressman, this student wasn't not warned. Every teenager, every junior high kid today knows the impact of putting this kind of information out there. He's saying, those who are saying boys will be boys, he's just a kid, he's 16 years old. What do you say to them?
Look, I'm always survived that young men survive their youth, and I'm speaking of myself as well. We make stupid decisions. This young man did something very stupid, and it is not Harvard's role to reform him. I think he can find redemption among his community, within his faith, and institutions that wish to offer it to him. I do think you have to ask hard questions about somebody that would post those things, even at 16 years old. Is that an indicator? But if it is not, and Eddie put it perfectly, seek redemption and perhaps this young man can soar. That's what we should wish for all of our nation's youth, not just the privileged who are getting admitted to Harvard, but those who never perhaps ever have the chance to graduate from high school because of the challenges life puts in front of them from the day they're born.
Eddie mentioned something earlier that I know struck all of us: entitlement. How often do you see a young, affluent boy who gets himself in a situation like this, and people saying he's young and he's innocent, and we don't grant that same grace to kids of a different background?
It is.
I.e., I'm talking about black boys.
Yeah, it's something that is as deeply woven into American society and American fabric as anything else.
How does it make you feel?
It makes you feel that we have people in our society that don't feel like they have benefited from that. In fact, if anything, they feel like their contributions and their bodies have been used to propel entitlement and growth and unequal divides. And so when I think about what it means to actually open up doors of opportunity for people, it's not about how can we create something or come with a false understanding of what being inclusive actually means. It's actually demonstrating the fact that being inclusive actually makes us stronger and better. Being inclusive actually helps us to live up to our greatest ideals, because this idea, the idea that we have people that this exclusively have won off of their own individual hard work and own individual, gifts, is just a fallacy. And that's something I think we as an American society have to understand.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.